I think even those folks have a hard time having conversations, and I think that's because the other 35% dominate the conversation and warp our minds about what most people want. So if I ask people, like, well, how many people like really hate you? I think people's initial, and there's science on this, people's initial guess is that many people really hate you, and many people really hate people who think like you. So we estimate, or we overestimate by like 200 or 300% how much the other side dislikes our side. That's massive, right? 300% is just a massive amount. And so once you learn that the other side doesn't hate you as much as you think, that goes a long way to being more willing to have these conversations, right? So there's such a powerful norm of reciprocity. If you move to a new neighborhood and I tell you, like, hey, your neighbor thinks you're a real jerk, right? He hates you. You've never met this guy, and then you see him like wheeling out his garbage to the curb, and you're like, look at that guy wheel his garbage like that. What a jerk. You know, I hate that guy. Like, you've never met this dude, right? But you hate him because you think he hates you. And so if you realize that the other side doesn't really hate you, maybe they don't really know your positions, then I think it goes a long way to making you feel a little warmer. But it's still hard to have these conversations because we get our talking points and our perceptions of the world from the people who are loudest. And it is harder. And I think the way to do it is to listen more, right? So I got an email from, and when you listen, ask the right questions. This is hard. But I got an email from someone who read the book in Western Australia. It's a very thoughtful email. And she said, look, we're like discussing immigration. She's like, I'm an immigrant to Australia. And my neighbor, who we've always had a great experience with, he's more of like a Trump supporter, even though it's Australia. It's kind of funny how these like transcend countries now. And we were talking about Israel, so I'm like, oh, wow, okay, you're going for it in this conversation. And I was trying to understand his view and trying to ask questions. So I'm reading, I'm like, that's great. Okay, you're asking questions, you're trying to understand, not persuade, understand, great, I'm here for it. And she's like, and here's the question I asked. I'm just wondering how you can like accept, thousands of civilian deaths in the side of Gaza. And I'm like, it's like maybe not the right question to like first get into. Like how are you comfortable supporting mass murder? Discuss, like that's not really the conversation, like the starter, even if that's what you think, right? And so I think we can listen a little more and maybe ask questions that are more geared to understanding, right? Like, thank you so much for sharing how you grew up. Super exciting to hear more about it. I was wondering if you could tell me kind of like how those early experiences maybe led to some of the political beliefs that you have. I know we voted differently, but I'd just love to know how those personal experiences of you growing up, maybe reflect in your political beliefs today. Like that could be a question you could ask someone and they would be happy to answer, right? And so maybe changing how we open our conversations goes a long way to having more respectful dialogue.
Very well put. I agree. Okay, great. Well, let's give a round of applause for Kurt. Look forward to hearing your questions as well. I think we have a mic that'll be going around.
Hi. So I'm hearing, or I think I'm hearing, that bridging gaps and whatnot is like a good thing. And I'm wondering, and I'm of that bias, and like, is it? Like, do we know that? And then, so that's on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I feel like outrage is kind of commodified on the internet. Like, there's a financial incentive to divide and cause outrage because it gets clicks. So, like, is bridging the gap good, and how did making the gap bigger get monetized?
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the second one, which is absolutely outrage is monetized, and absolutely algorithms select for outrage because it's such an attention grabber, right? Because it's so important in our evolutionary past and our modern lives, right? It's absolutely monetized. This is why knitting is better than being on X, right? And there are social media platforms that don't monetize it. So there's a forum, there's a platform called Front Porch Forum. It's like hyper-local. It's only in Vermont and a bit of upstate New York right now. But it's like you have to sign up with your name. It's moderated. It's all about like local community happenings. And we have some work showing that like as you move from the local to the national, you just talk a lot more about morality and power because it's something everyone understands. So I think we should try to be off kind of these national platforms and be on something more local. In terms of bridging the gap, is it a good thing? I mean, that question has many layers. I think it's a good thing for your mental health, typically, if you're not constantly angry at people, if you feel like you can have a conversation, if you feel like you're part of a community, right? Even if there's some disagreement there, I think that's a good thing. You can even, so I get these questions from both sides, but especially progressives now, they're like, look, like, there's all these changes happening in the government, like this is terrible. Shouldn't you just like fight? You just like be angry and fight. And I think if you're concerned about progressive causes, then yes, like you can stay convicted and you can like donate and organize and do all those things. But it turns out that to create change, you even if you're just like Machiavellian about it, you need to understand what the other side's thinking, right? You need to understand what motivates people, what they're thinking about, and how to kind of like make sense of what folks are doing. And then you need to find allies. You need to build coalitions. So things like civil rights or women's suffrage, right? Those things happened. A relatively powerless group was able to affect change by kind of understanding the kind of levers and the psychology of folks and push that change forward. So I think it's a good thing, kind of spiritually in a sense. It's maybe also a good thing because America is founded on like pluralistic, although flawed in many ways, but founded as like a pluralistic nation. A government that only has like, a country that only has like one party is like not a place where I want to live. Like I don't want to live in China. I don't want to live in a communist dictatorship, So I think it's good for the country to have these kind of like different opinions, but even just pragmatically, you just need to understand where other folks are coming from. Good question. We've got Zoom folks.
Hi, I was wondering, since outrage has been growing and growing in my impression, are people like burning out on it? I mean, when the internet first came out, people were like, oh, I got an email from, somebody who inherited all this money or some Nigerian, whatever, there were these things that people were just falling for. And I feel like at this point, a lot of people are like, outrage, well, I've been outraged 10 times before breakfast. It's just, I feel like it's kind of burning out to some extent. I mean,
yeah.
I'm hoping, but I wondered what we could do to hasten that.
Well, I'd like to say like it's burned out and then just stops, but I think, so people are part of this exhausted majority, and I think people are exhausted because they're feeling outraged so much. But I think it's like a nerve rubbed raw, like even if we're tired of it, it's still kicking us up into high gear. Like probably everyone here has felt outraged in the last couple days listening to the news or like talking to someone, right? Like it's still there. I think maybe social media is just getting better at eliciting it, right? Like the political messaging is just getting like more on point. Is that?
Well, I guess like one group I contribute to, that's a peace organization. There was something ridiculous announced, and they had this outrage response, and it was like, that's not going to work. If somebody yells at you and you yell louder, that has not worked in the past 8 years. So why, it's going to work better to be the adult in the room. So these frantic, angry messages, I'm now just deleting them. I used to, run out to every protest, but now I'm just like, doesn't seem to be a way to accomplish anything.
I think you're exactly right. I think there's not many folks who are part of peace organizations, unfortunately. So maybe you're part of the enlightened few. But I think most folks are kind of like living in a constant bath of outrage. And they want to be less outraged, but it's very hard when you're surrounded by all sorts of social media and news and so forth.
Hi. What do you see as the intersection here between outrage and the fact that shame is one of the primary tools of oppression? And particularly, it's a tool for oppressive systems and not, well, I guess I'm going to leave it there for now. And just
Yeah, could you say a little more instead of leaving it there? Just to kind of like give me the contours of the question a little bit more. Like specific examples? Yes.
Well, I mean, I think the example, I think that it's tied together. Like the outrage on social media is sort of a cartoon magnification of what already exists in society. Some people would say that that comes from Abrahamic religions and that we have this binary of good and evil, and then that goes back to your moral philosophy and how our brains are wired. But our brains are wired to belong. And so things that are beliefs or whatever that are not in alignment with an other, shame is a means of controlling people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. So I think it might be useful even just to take a step back and a kind of like broader understanding, and like outrage is itself fundamentally like a reasonable good thing in society. So if you think back to how we evolved, you know, like we're living in small tribes, someone does something really bad, like we're all trying to share food and then someone hoards all the food, right? We're like trying to avoid famine and like there's a person there eating all the food. And so we all get outraged. It's kind of very legitimate outrage. And a way of punishing a person, you could exile them, or you could make them feel shame in the hope that you would change their behavior, or guilt, right? So with kids, right, oftentimes like, you know, my daughter lied about something and it was like something not very consequential, but we intentionally made her feel bad about herself so that she might not lie to us in the future when it mattered. And so there was a kind of legitimate role there for feelings of outrage on behalf of my wife and I, and then some kind of amount of like shame or guilt on behalf of our kid. And we're trying to control our kids' behavior to make them be part of society and reasonable human beings. But it's certainly the case that not only is outrage amplified today beyond the bounds of like what's functional or reasonable, but you could imagine making people feel shame as well is also beyond those bounds. But if you're having a conversation about like, well, what's a reasonable amount of shame to make someone feel, I think we can agree that it can be badly deployed, but there's like a big debate there, right? Like, is tweeting something, right, is that worthy of being shamed? Is that worthy of, like, let's say, losing your job if you're trying to make a joke on social media? Some would say yes, some would say no. So I think the conversation just kind of spins again when we talk about shame. But it's a fair point, for sure.
So you mentioned once the word spirituality. In your view, what is the source of human spirituality, and are we as hardwired to that connection with the creative force, if it exists and does it exist, as we are to everything else that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a little different than the focus of this book, but I also study the psychology of religion. And so the argument from like evolutionary cognitive science is that we are kind of hardwired both to detect agents in the world. So if you're walking at night in the forest and you hear a twig snap, right, our default is to be like, that's an animal and not the wind. And the idea is like we kind of bootstrap that up to think like, well, if the clouds move in a particular way, like maybe that's an agent, right, maybe a divine agent. And we're also hardwired to find meaning in life, right? So if this terrible thing happened, it's not enough just to say like, well, sometimes terrible things happen, right? We ask why, and like, why me? And so I have a a paper from a long time ago that looks at how much people are, the religiosity of people in each US state, and I correlate that with how much suffering there is in a state. So infant mortality and like environmental disasters, and the correlation there is about 0.7. It's a very high correlation. If you control for education, it's still very high. And so this idea is that like we're looking for patterns in the world, and that we bring in a kind of like agent to account for those patterns. And of course, it's much richer than that, right? There's questions of like feeling connection and spirituality, like awe, right? I know the Greater Good Science Center and folks like Dr. Kellner have done a lot of work on like feelings of awe and scale, and so we ascribe, right? There's all sorts of ways that our mind kind of pushes us to perceive the divine, and so I think we are hardwired, but for many reasons.
Thank you for this talk. I have a question a bit more around the outrage. I think I don't dispute that social media definitely amplifies this, the echo chamber nature of social media. But I also think objectively, isn't it true that it's become more and more difficult to get, for example, the government to change things or people empowered to change things? I mean, when I was younger, it seemed like if something was going awry in society, if a couple people wrote good letters or complained, that was normally enough to change things enough so that nobody had to go out and protest and become really crazy and outraged, right? Because I feel from, for example, a parent's perspective during the school closures, I mean, it was incremental, right? Initially, you thought you could still do something by writing letters and talking to your representatives and doing the political process. And then at some point, everyone realized it's just a total lie. Nobody is doing anything. Nobody is planning to do anything, despite being confronted with the obvious and demonstrable harms, right? So it's not, I think, your central tenet here is maybe a bit, I don't know, I would say maybe a bit naive, because people see the harm, it's demonstrated. We show the data, but they don't care, right? So this is the question, you know, we've seen this in the school closures, and it kind of riles up the outrage, right? Because initially you think you can complain, for sure they will make the right decision. And then it's going up, 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 because they just are intransigent. They won't make the right decision. Although they're confronted with, for example, increased number of child suicides and things like that are demonstrably horrible. And on the other side, they just won't move. So this drives it, I think, too. I think there's a real change here, like that I observe. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, so a couple points there. I think in terms of confronting people with the undeniable facts of harm, I don't think those facts are undeniable, because you can see harm on the other side, right? So you're like, look, there's kids committing suicide, but also imagine that everyone gets COVID, right? And they die that way. I mean, I think
I just intersect there because I work in public health. That data, that was undeniable. That was clear. We have epidemiologists who could tell you the number of people who will get severe morbidity, potential mortality with COVID infection at that time. That can be modeled. And you could also tell how many kids were committing suicide and had severe depression and mental health issues. So that was, it was undeniable. It really was. I mean, you can decide like a little bit more and here and there, you know, the numbers, but that wasn't the issue. They just didn't want to do it. It was political capture.
Yeah,
right?
so I think most people are not experts in processing public health data, right? So this is why people can be anti-vaxxers when it comes to autism, because they have a story that they anchor on, and they're worried about those harms, right? But to the broader point, I do think, I mean, data show that we are more gridlocked than we've ever been in Congress. Part of that is these kind of super identities of political parties. So other structural factors like having primaries, right? When national politics were just the kind of like small set of elite people whose last names were like Bush or Kennedy, it was maybe easier to get things done because there wasn't this like intense competition to show that you're like the most committed to like your party's base priorities. And so there's been a lot of changes, but I think people are genuinely, again, committed to kind of protecting themselves from harm, but they're just really bad at processing the data, right?
But in this case, we had advisory committees, right? And this was, the school boards had public health advisory committees. You had all these people. So that's why they had the advisors to interpret it, but it still fell on completely deaf ears. And, you know, the,
Well, people, yeah, but
and
I
the
have-
committees were also intentionally put together in a way that they could just override them easily. So I think it's just that, you know, I've been in this for a while too, trying to have conversations with people who think differently and find a middle ground, but it only works if both are sincere, you know. It doesn't work if one is actually corrupt or captured or really not interested in that inconvenient truth that you're trying to bring up, right? So, and I think this is something we're really running into. It's, you know, on the personal level, there's a lot we can do with what you suggest, and I think it's a very good idea. But if we work with people in power, I think it's just a completely different game.
I think we have some questions on Zoom, so let me.
Oh, yeah, on Zoom.
Okay, let's see. So as a parent, Ayata Alea asks, as a parent of 9 children, my experience has been that shaming children is both harmful and counterproductive. Instead, working with the child to understand why they were dishonest, then work with that to address the underlying issue and help them to find better ways to get a need met. Sorry, that was more of a comment.
Yeah,
But-
I'm not into shaming kids as much as just be like,
Let
you know,
me go to
don't
a
be a jerk
question.
kid.
So Carrie Alport asks, what are your thoughts on using moral outrage as propaganda?
I guess I'm generally against propaganda, but I mean, it's a good question. It gets at something that's like that I think is important and comes up a lot, and that is that people already know, people in power, people who are like doing political messaging, already know the power of harm and outrage, right? They're already using this. If you look at every political campaign, I don't know, decades, it's like, it's about fear, it's about threats, it's about these people are different from you and they're coming for your kids, right? All the way up, I don't know, you can look at like ancient war propaganda. It's always been like this. And so I think part of the reason for writing this book is to kind of like let everyday people know the facts of our minds that political operatives have known, at least implicitly, for a long time, right? And use these things for good as much as we can, right? Like, I think there's still out there that people are pushing this kind of like fear-based agenda because it works. But if we can use this kind of understanding of harm to better bridge divides and like use it for more peace, then like that's, I think, a good thing.
So, okay, let me get some questions in person.
Great, thank you. So I'm struck by a couple things. One, what you said about humans being prey more so than predator, and then the sort of outsized percentage that we think the other side doesn't like us. And it feels like to me that these kinds of conversations of meeting each other in the moral wound are really effective when we're in person, but we're afraid of each other. And we're afraid to have conversations, especially with people we think hate us 3,000 or 300% more. So do you have any research or any thoughts on how we start to be less afraid of each other and have these kinds of conversations?
Yes, yeah, and you're exactly right. It's like baring your neck, you know, to a person you think is going to attack you is very stressful. And so in the book, I talk about like, look, there's this paradox here, right? Opening up is really effective, but it's really hard to do with someone you think is the enemy or someone who's going to attack you. And so I go through kind of like 3 tips for having more civil conversations. I call it like CIV, CIV, the beginning of more civil conversations. And the first C is just connecting as a person. So before, like if you just like start a conversation about politics, it's gonna go poorly, right? Unless you're like really willing just to like ask questions, right? And just like be chill. But it turns out connecting with someone as a human being is often about just asking questions, right? So you could ask them questions about food, about music, about where they grew up, about fashion, about where they met their spouse. You're like, there's 100 things you could talk about to someone that's not politics, even though like politics is the back of your mind. And in fact, we vastly underestimate, one, how much people like having questions asked of them, and we vastly underestimate how much people like having deep questions asked of them. Right? So if I'm like, oh, it's really nice to meet you. I was just wondering, like, maybe just think, like, when was the last time you cried? And like, or like, how do you think you're gonna die? You know, like, you'd be like, you're insane, right? Like, I'm gonna move my subway seat. But it turns out when you randomly assign people to have these conversations on trains, they really like them, you know, and they feel connected. And so question asking is really important. I think, like, I was just use, like, imagine you're on a date, right? Like, the person who's gonna be a good person on a date is the person who asks you questions and not just, like, telling you about themselves, right? So connect, and then you can invite them to share their perspective. And everyone loves being invited to a party, but no one loves being forced to attend, you know? So, like, the invitation is really important. And again, it's not like, well, justify how you, like, how you support mass murder. Like, that's not really an invitation, because an invitation you can say no to, right? So I'm trying to understand here, right? Because the election's really confusing and complicated, and I'm just trying to understand. Notice I'm saying understand a lot. And I was just wondering, maybe now's not the right time, but I'd love just to hear your perspective on, you know, how you think about immigration. And, you know, all know about the talking heads on social media. Like, I'm not interested in what they say. I'm interested in what you think and maybe the experiences in your life that led you to feel a certain way. Now you're going to tell me what you think. You're going to feel seen. You're going to feel heard, especially because the last point of CIV, V is validate. Right? And this is like couples therapy too, whatever. Like, all this stuff is like, you know, where it's like you're arguing with anyone, right? Like, someone tells you the perspective and then you're not like, yeah, but what about, like, that is not validate, right? Or like, what do you think about all these things, right? Like, if you're having an argument with your spouse and you're like, well, this is how I feel. And you're like, yeah, what about that time you said this to my mother? You know, you're like, okay, that's not really validate. So validate is like, I understand it's really hard for you to share this opinion. I really appreciate it. Also, you need to understand they're going to offend you a little bit, right? If you're talking about abortion, they're either going to say, like, well, you hate women or you're a baby killer. Like, those are just the talking points. So you need to be like, okay, great. You know, like, thanks so much for sharing. You know, I kind of have different opinions, but I just really appreciate you putting into words. And some people are like, well, why would I do that? Because it's like, seems really comfortable. You do that because then the other person will respect you more. So I had an Uber ride with a Christian nationalist a while ago, and I got in the car, and we went straight to politics because I said, this is what I study. You know, I'm like a moral psychologist. He's like, oh, good. I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. Okay, well, what's an atypical Christian nationalist? Please tell me. I asked him questions. He's like, this is what I think about the state. This is what I think about the family. This is what I think about the church. Whatever. I learned all about it. 20 minutes later, I'm driving up to the airport, and we start talking about abortion. And he says, you know, I'm pro-life, and I just think anyone who's pro-choice, you know, I just think it's like the Gestapo. And I say, like, look, we can't have a good faith conversation about a moral issue if you compare someone to the Nazis, right? Like, I teach a class on this. It's just not acceptable, right? Because, like, half of America has this opinion, and half of America isn't, like, pro-Holocaust. You know, it's just like, it's not okay to bring up in these conversations. And so he pauses, and he says, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't, it was just hard. It's hard for me to say it. Like, it's hard for me to make sense. It's really complicated in my mind. But, like, here's what I think. And he basically articulated a slippery slope position. That if you disregard the sanctity of life of, like, fetuses, then you'll maybe do it with, like, the lives of other groups or other vulnerable people. That's totally a reasonable position, philosophically speaking. But what came out was Nazis, because that's what everyone says, right? So, but because I listened to him for 20 minutes, he had the kind of space and grace to apologize and take it back. And when I left, he says, you know, thanks for listening. Like, I totally understand, you know, I understand a little bit more now. And, like, so he's a little more, like, you know, down with pro-choice, even if he's still pro-life, you know? So I think it does lead to change. I think it is a good idea to bridge divides because you can kind of, like, respect each other more, even if you don't give up convictions. But it is difficult, and it does take practice. But it's worth practicing.
Hi there. Thank you for this talk and all that has been shared by everyone in the audience so far. I am curious, obviously I haven't read the book, but I'm curious if you have done any research in your field around the ways that trauma is a part of all this and so forth. I'm specifically thinking of it from my professional viewpoint. I'm a somatic psychologist, and so we do a lot of work around understanding the nervous system, the fear response, and all these things. And so many of the terms I've heard in the conversation today feel like we're getting to continually talk about the way we are wired biologically, ultimately, and then how that juxtaposition that we also have moral and ethical and emotional centers. But I'm really wondering about your thoughts on this contrast between, yes, we are wired around fear and danger and X, Y, and Z, and we also have a sense of morality, hopefully, as a part of who we are. And maybe, yeah, what you could say about how trauma influences this conversation, if that's been a part of your study and research.
Sure. So I'm not an expert on trauma, although I work with some folks that are. So we have a toolkit that just came out, working with an organization called Beyond Conflict, and they're really focused on trauma and a kind of trauma-based understanding for how faith leaders can navigate contentious and emergency situations in their communities. So it's definitely connected, and it definitely colors how people see threats and how people respond to those threats. So I'm not an expert, but there's like 30 pages of like stuff in this toolkit, and I'm happy to share it with you after the talk. But it's a great question.
Do we have time for one more, or do we need to wrap up?
Yeah, hey Kurt, thanks for doing this today. You know, I want to build on something you were talking about earlier about how, you know, we can. To be a better advocate, you can if you want to be an advocate, you can still be a better advocate if you understand the other side's concerns and their perceived harms and so on. And the other thing you said about that was that you can still believe. When I tell people that, what I often get pushback on is like, well, no, then I'm legitimizing. If I have a conversation with them and I listen to them and I hear their concerns, I'm legitimizing that they have this other piece that you talked about, which was that you can also believe that they may be a bigger contributor to the problem, right? And you might be wrong about that, but you can certainly believe it. And I try to explain how you can sort of simultaneously, or maybe you can help us just speak to the question of how you can simultaneously believe the other side is a bigger contributor to the problem, but still not want to make the problem worse by sort of using this derogatory language and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think you hit on the kind of broader issue of pluralism, right, and the challenges of pluralism. And so I'm part of an organization called the New Pluralists, and there's folks on the left and folks on the right, and we're all trying to figure out how to make our country more pluralistic. And it's a tough paradox, right, because you want to understand where people are coming from, but also you want to hold fast to your own moral convictions, and that's okay. And so there is an inherent paradox there about how we do that. And people don't like living in contradiction, right? Like, we like total certainty. Unfortunately, it's part of the human condition to have uncertainty, right? But I think that and there's a really big debate in pluralism about like what to do with anti-pluralists, right? So what do you do about people who are really against other people, like the KKK? Like, do they deserve a spot at the table of expressing viewpoints when they are so against other people's views? Should you try to understand them? Or like, oh, I sat down with some KKK members and like, I tried to see them as human, right? I feel like if you wrote that, people would be like, you're a monster, right? You're legitimizing like literally a kind of like pro-Nazi propaganda. And yet, there is a man named Daryl Davis. He's a black blues musician, and he made it basically his life's work to sit down with KKK members and have conversations with them. I mean, these are people whose ideology is explicitly against people of his race. And yet, he sat down and he had conversations with them about their views and tried to see how they viewed the world. And it turns out the reason that they hold those convictions, as wrong as they are, connects to their perceptions of harm, right? So one KK member would say, well, I just think, black men are like genetically more violent, and so that's why there's more black men in prison, and so we need to keep them separated for like the safety of our children. And he would listen patiently and be like, well, I'm a black man, you know, like, do you think I'm violent, right? Provide a very strong counterexample. And through this conversation, de-radicalized, like, I think more than 200 KKK members. They hung up their robes. Should we have to do that? No, right? But is it amazing that he did it? I do think it's amazing that he did it, and it took so much bravery and courage on his part. So it's part of this paradox of pluralism, and each of us must kind of solve that in our own way. But I think there are really impressive paragons, like people who are trying to understand while holding fast to their convictions.
Well, I'll just add that it seems like some people are afraid if they listen to the person, they're going to be forced to change their mind.
Right. And no, you don't. You can still believe your moral convictions.
We are going to wrap up, but Kurt will be here signing books. Sorry we didn't get to everybody, but stick around, and it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone at home as well. This has been a great conversation. Let's give you another hand. Thank you for being here, Kurt. And that's it. Thank you.